Well, welcome to the Based podcast. Today's guest is a really good one, Dr. Robert Epstein, who is a behavioural psychologist from the United States, and he is the director of the American Institute for Behavioural Research and Technology. And he's been doing some incredible work monitoring online tech companies such as Google and many others, YouTube, and seeing what they're doing behind the scenes, behind their algorithms. Now, we recorded this earlier today. Unfortunately, it looks like we've got some tech glitches with the video from Dr. Epstein, but hang in there with us. This is a really important interview. He discusses some things which are critical for the Australian political landscape and commercial landscape and societal landscape. You're not going to want to miss this. So hang in there. The audio is good. The video is a bit glitchy, but let's get into it. Dr. Robert Epstein, thank you for coming on Base Podcast. We're hoping to give you a bit of give you the floor in front of an Australian audience, because I don't think the issues that you talk about really have much understanding. I don't think there is much understanding about them in Australia, and I'm really hoping you can kind of reflect on some of the research that you've been doing and look at it perhaps even through the Australian context. Some of the stuff you've been talking about out of the United States will be very relevant to us as well. But just to introduce you to our audience, you're a researcher, you actually have a PhD in psychology, and you've been doing some pretty amazing research in relation to online surveillance and manipulation, particularly through platforms like Google. So I'll kick it off like this with a very simple question. Are we all the products?
Yes, we are the products. Google invented a business model, which is called the surveillance business model, or some people call it surveillance capitalism. And under this model, they post a lot of services online which appear to be free, and they trick you into using these online platforms to give away a tremendous amount of information about yourself. If you've been using the internet for 20 years, Google has the equivalent of more than 3 million pages of information about you. But the point is they trick you into giving away personal information using Google Maps and Google Docs and Gmail and Chrome and Android and YouTube. And people are just mindless. They just mindlessly use these surveillance platforms, not understanding what kind of company Google really is. It's on the surface, it appears to be a kindly librarian that just does nice things for you for free. But if you really understand what kind of company this is, you'll understand none of this is free. You pay for it with your freedom, because this company is really an advertising, surveillance, and manipulation company. That's really what it is. From a business perspective, that's what it is. The online stuff is just there to trick you. So they don't really, to answer your question directly, Google has no products. More than 90% of their revenue has always come from selling us, from selling the information that we provide to them mindlessly, and they sell us. So we are the product.
And that's well demonstrated with something like Google Maps, for example, where the software that you once had through a company, say like TomTom, which you would pay for, you'd pay a subscription, you now get free, but you're actually part of you are the product, as you say. You're feeding information about traffic and congestion and things you see on the roads and those sort of things. Whereas perhaps a company like Apple actually has a product to sell, so doesn't maybe have the same focus on selling your data. Is that sort of a semi-accurate reflection?
So Apple and Microsoft make more than 90% of their revenue by selling actual products, software or hardware. But Google makes more than 90% of its revenue by selling us. Now, the problem at the moment is that this model is so profitable. I mean, think about it. They don't have to manufacture anything. They don't have to inventory anything. This model is so profitable at this point that tens of thousands of other businesses around the world have copied this model. So this model has been spreading all over the world, and that means it's going to be very hard to get rid of it, to declare it to be illegal, because so many companies are making money off of it. And that's we're kind of stuck. So I have been concerned about these issues now for about almost 13 years. And I began studying Google very, very closely, and then studying other companies as well, other tech companies. And I've ended up doing two kinds of things over the years. So the first thing I've done is to learn about ways in which they can manipulate people online. The internet has made it possible for big companies to manipulate people in ways that they cannot see. And I've discovered over the years 10 different techniques that these companies can use to manipulate, for example, millions of votes in the United States in a national election. Right now, Google, for example, can shift between 6.4 million and 25.5 million votes in our presidential election, which is coming up this fall. And they can do this without anyone knowing, and we have no laws or regulations in place to stop them, because no one ever anticipated that these problems would arise. So I've discovered these methods. I've using very rigorous research methodology. I published my findings in peer-reviewed journals. I've testified twice before the United States Congress about my findings. It's very serious work, and it's a very serious problem. It really undermines democracy. It means that roughly since 2012 in the US, the free and fair election has been an illusion. And around the world, at least as of 2015, Google was determining the outcomes of upwards of 25% of the national elections in the world. So it's not just the US that's at risk, it's Australia and every other country in the world except mainland China, and they have their own control issues there. Obviously, it's the government itself is obsessed with control. So I've done that. That's one thing I've done. But then in 2015, I was asked by the Attorney General of one of our states, he asked, okay, they have this power, they can use all these techniques. How do you know if they're using them? He asked. And I couldn't answer him at the time. I mean, all I said was, well, you would need a whistleblower. Someone would have to leave the company and say we're doing this. As of 2015, there weren't any people like that. A few years later, people started leaving Google and actually started spilling the truth. But the point is, I became kind of obsessed with that issue. How, from a technology perspective, using technology, could I find out whether Google was actually using all these techniques, and whether they were shifting votes, and whether they were censoring content, and whether they were boosting other content, and so on, and whether they were doing these things strategically to manipulate people, to change people's thinking and their attitudes and their purchases and their votes. And beginning in 2016, I set up the first ever monitoring system to track what content Google and Bing and Yahoo were sending to real voters. And so, in other words, I was doing to Google what they do to us and our kids 24 hours a day. I was surveilling them. And the first system that we set up was very small. We preserved 13,000 searches on Google, Bing, and Yahoo, and about 100,000 web pages to which the search results linked. That allowed us to see whether Google was showing people biased search results, in those high-ranking results that they show you were they favoring one candidate or another, because that shifts votes, believe it or not, shifts a lot of votes. That can easily shift between 20 and 80% of the votes of undecided voters without any awareness at all on their part, because people trust those high-ranking search results that Google sends you, because normally people are conducting very simple searches for simple facts, and those answers always end up at the top. So we learn to trust what's at the top. And when we ask someday an open-ended question like, what's the best dog food or what's the best restaurant around here, we trust what Google puts at the top. So Google uses that power to shift the thinking and the votes of undecided voters. So that was 2016. Over the years, we've spent about $7 million building bigger and more powerful monitoring systems, or you call them surveillance systems if you like, systems for tracking what Google and other companies are showing to real voters, and now we've expanded it to children. So to show what content are they sending to children and to teens? And the answers are very, very disturbing, because what we have found is that Google alone shifted more than 2.6 million votes in the 2016 election, the presidential election here. In the 2020 election, they shifted more than 6 million votes to Joe Biden. So if you take Google out of the 2020 election, Donald Trump, who I did not support, but Donald Trump would have won that election easily. We've built bigger and bigger systems until last year, I finally decided the time had come to build a permanent nationwide system. So by the end of 2023, we had in place the world's first nationwide monitoring system, which at this moment is gathering data from the computers of a politically balanced group of more than 15,000 registered voters in all 50 US states, and from a lot of their children as well, with the parents' permission, of course. And so we are preserving not just a few thousand pieces of data that Google and other companies are sending to users. At this point in time, we have preserved in the last few months more than 95 million of these what Google calls ephemeral experiences. In other words, we're preserving a tremendous amount of data that Google and Facebook and Instagram and other companies are sending to real people. And by the way, if you're not somehow looking over the shoulders of real people to see what these companies are sending them, you have no idea what they're sending them, because they send personalized content. So you must be looking over the shoulders, with their permission, of real people to see what these companies are actually sending. And that's what we're doing now.
So can you explain that? That's just, you talk about real people. I think people would be shocked to learn that the sort of results that I get on my Google search, if I was to do one, would be completely different to those that you'd get. That I think is a bit of a shock. But can you summarize that? How does that work?
Yes, this is called personalization. It's also called customization. Google has always taken pride in the fact that they've learned how to personalize content that they send to you. They've bragged about it over and over again for a long time, that they've become so good at this. And of course, they do this by taking all the personal information that you keep giving them, and they build models of you. They build models, and they use those models to send you special content. Now, my wife, who unfortunately died a few years ago in a tragic and kind of suspicious car accident, But my wife, she loved that. She loved the personalized content on Google. She said Google was her personal shopper. So, some people actually really like this arrangement, but it's extremely dangerous because the more they know about you, the easier it is for them to manipulate you. So let me tell you about some new research that we've just completed. In previous years, we've shown that in experiments that if we present people with data that are biased, they're biased to favor one political candidate, for example. And by the way, we've mainly used Australian elections in our experiments. So because we want our participants in the experiments to be undecided. And so we're using American subjects in our experiments, but we use Australian elections because that way, since the Americans have never heard of these candidates, that way they for sure are undecided when the experiment begins. And what we've shown is that if we present people with biased content that favors one candidate or the other, that will shift people's voting preferences toward that candidate. If we make that candidate look really good with the bias that we're showing people, it actually shifts voting preferences, and it can do so dramatically. But very recently, we got concerned about this issue that you just raised, the personalization issue. And so we asked, what happens if we send people not just biased information, but why don't we also personalize it? Let's find out what news sources people most prefer, which talk show hosts they like the best, which celebrities they like the best. And this time, some people will be randomly assigned to a group in which they get biased content that favors one candidate or another in an election. But other people will be getting biased content, the same content, exactly the same content, but it's personalized. It's now coming to them from a news source that they trust. So the results have been astonishing. If we send people biased content, we might get a shift in voting preferences of 20% or more, which is a lot, by the way. That's big. That can flip an election very easily. But the other group that's getting the same content, but it's now personalized, those people will shift by more than 60%, 3 times the shift, which tells me that all these years that we've been doing experiments with biased content, we've probably been underestimating the damage that such content can do. Because now that we've learned recently that if we personalize the content, its impact is much greater. So yes, my wife Misty, she loved having a personal shopper on her computer, sure. But the problem is with that personalization and all the surveillance is it gives these companies more and more power to manipulate us entirely without our knowledge. We've shown this in experiments that we can produce enormous shifts in people's thinking and behavior and their votes with no one having the slightest awareness that they are being manipulated.
And so in the Australian context, I mean, are you seeing, a level of bias that you think might interfere with Australian elections or in the past or in the future? I mean, and is it a conscious thing, do you think, from these companies?
Well, we don't do monitoring in Australia. We've been asked by people from 7 countries so far, one of them is Australia, to help them set up monitoring systems in their countries. Because unless you have a monitoring system in place, you don't actually know what's happening. You don't know what these companies are doing. Yeah. You don't know how they might be indoctrinating your children. You don't know how they might be undermining your democracy. Australia has no monitoring system. The European Union has no monitoring system. So we're the first country to ever build such a system. And to answer your question, at least to speculate, I would speculate that if anyone at Google in US or Google in Australia, if anyone in Google has any political interests in Australia, in other words, they have any reason to prefer one candidate over another or one party over another, I have no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that they are manipulating your elections. The fact of the matter is that no one has ever figured out really how to regulate them. They've tried in Australia, by the way. Australia a few years ago passed a law giving the government access to Google's algorithms. At the time, I just laughed because access to algorithms tells you nothing. Algorithms are completely opaque. Even the programmers who write them no longer understand them. Algorithms, that's silly. But the point is, there are people in Australia who are very concerned about companies like Google. And I have no doubt that Google is using all of these techniques that we've discovered in Australia, but you can't know for sure without a whistleblower or a monitoring system. And you can't count on whistleblowers, obviously, but you can count on monitoring systems. In other words, the systems that we've built can be implemented all over the world, and they must be. They must be implemented around the world because that is the way you can make these companies accountable to the public. And we have gotten Google to back down 3 times so far because of the monitoring we have been doing. And as our system gets larger and larger and runs faster and faster, and as we reveal more and more about what Google and other companies are doing, as we reveal that to authorities, to the courts, as we, in other words, shine a brighter and brighter light on what it is they're actually doing, they will back down at some point completely. Because as a United States Supreme Court justice said 100 years ago, sunlight is the best disinfectant. It kills all the germs. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing in building monitoring systems.
This is, and I heard you talk to Joe Rogan about this very facet of the whole thing that Eisenhower actually, in his famous 1962 or so speech, talked about the military-industrial complex, but he also forewarned about the technical, the sort of the technical side of a technical industrial complex as well. And you said at the time that it's not the future, we're living it right now. I mean, we are presumably looking down the barrel in the next 10 years of a total lockdown on this stuff. Is there anything in your mind that can or should be done now that can sort of trim the edges on this or hold it off? Or is this a market-led fix, or is it a regulatory fix in order to make these companies kind of fall into line?
Well, I can tell you for sure one thing that could be done in Australia or the EU. Australia, I think, might do it first because it's very simple, very light touch regulation. Google would fight in the courts, but I think the Australian government would win. All Australia has to do is to declare Google's index, which is the database they use to generate all their search results, to declare Google's index to be a public commons. What does that mean? Well, if you go back in history, you find that when any commodity becomes essential, like water, gasoline, telephone communications, when any commodity becomes essential, meaning people can no longer survive without it, then the government has to step in. It always steps in. Every single time it steps in and it says, this is now owned by the public. You can't privatize this because it's essential, and it's going to be following rules that we set. And because we have to protect people, we cannot have private companies deciding whether or not you can drink water or you can buy gasoline, or you can use your telephone. We just can't have that. And so this is very, very common in history. And now we're at the point where data has become essential, absolutely essential. We're all carrying, supercomputers in our pockets, and we all go to Google, or at least 92% of the world goes to Google to try to find out where information is. And the fact is, Google is now the gateway to virtually all information in the world, and it's an essential service. And so a government like Australia's government could step in and declare that to be essential commodity and to make it a public commons. Now, what happens then? If you make it a public commons, it means you can kind of control it. In this case, what would happen is you would now allow other companies access to that index, so they could build their own search engines on top of Google's data. It's data sharing. And high school students could build their own search engines on top of Google's data. And all these search engines would be really good because they'd be using Google's data. And Google would have competitors, hundreds at first, and then thousands of competitors. And those competitors would be all focusing on niche markets. In other words, you'd have this world of search engines that look just like newspapers and magazines and podcasts, all of which focus on different niche markets. And it works. And they also balance each other out so that no one can really take total control of a country because there's so many different news sources. So this is how you would completely end Google's worldwide monopoly on search. You would do what we've done over and over again for hundreds of years, and that is we would declare their index, the data that they have, to be a public commons, a public commodity, which it is. For all intents, all practical purposes, it is. We're already there. So that's one option, which I think Australia could be the first place that tries it, and I think it would work. Now, you could also declare the surveillance business model to be illegal, but as I told you before, I don't think that's going to happen because too many companies are using it now because it's so profitable. And in my opinion, the most effective thing you can do is to build large-scale permanent monitoring systems. So I have come to believe that that is the ultimate solution because if you think about it, laws and regulations move very, very slowly. Tech moves at the speed of light. Yeah. But monitoring systems are tech. Monitoring systems can grow as fast as other technologies grow. And it can always be there looking over people's shoulders and seeing what these companies are doing. And if they're doing anything that is irregular, and I can give you an example from today's news. If these companies are doing anything that is irregular, these monitoring systems will expose them immediately to authorities and to journalists and to public interest groups, for example, that try to protect children or that try to protect the integrity of elections. I'll give you an example from today's news. Today, Elon Musk sent out a tweet. You can confirm this easily. He sent out a tweet saying, look at this. Google is suppressing search suggestions related to Donald Trump. If you type in Donald on Google, you'll get Donald Duck. If you type in Donald Trump and then the letter A, well, then on Bing and Yahoo, of course, you're going to get assassination, and you're going to get a lot of links to assassination information. But on Google, if you type in Donald Trump and the letter A, you get nothing. You get nothing. They're suppressing content related to the attempted assassination, and they're suppressing all content with respect to Donald Trump. Now, I don't like Trump. I never liked Trump, but he was a former president of the United States. and he is a candidate now. Think of the arrogance of this company. That's why. So you have to set up this competition system that I mentioned, because if Google has 1,000 competitors, then it doesn't matter. They can suppress anything they want to suppress. But if they're controlling virtually access to all knowledge around the world outside of mainland China, you cannot let that continue. You can't. It must become a public commodity. So anyway, today's news, Elon Musk tweeting about the fact that Google is suppressing content related to Trump and the Trump attempted assassination. Now that's a pretty bold, I would say almost outrageous kind of thing to do. And guess what? Just a few days ago, our latest publication in a peer-reviewed journal was published, and it's about what we call SSE, the search suggestion effect. And in this scientific paper, which includes experiments, we show that by manipulating search suggestions, which is what Google just got caught doing, a company like Google can turn a 50-50 split among undecided voters into a 90-10 split, with no one having the slightest idea that they have been manipulated. So we have a brand new study, and we have Google getting caught doing exactly that. They're manipulating search suggestions, which is an extremely powerful way to manipulate people's thinking and their votes.
Well, when you think that, I mean, most people, Google has 96% of the world's search traffic, I think, or maybe more, or slightly less. But it is an enormous power. I mean, Google effectively controls the entire internet in a sense, in a practical sense, but also in a figurative sense. I'm interested in understanding that through the Australian perspective, given that we've got 9 months to go before an election. Most countries around the world, people don't get into election mode until the last month. So let's use that as a marker. We have pretty well same-day elections with a little bit of postal and pre-poll, but it all happens in the last month. As a way of people understanding from a practical point of view how it is this company could potentially shift votes with a bias one way or the other. Take the example of an undecided Australian voter who decides to go on and find out a little bit more about candidate one, let's say a conservative candidate, and factoring in that also deals with YouTube as well, part of the same parent company, Alphabet. What does that look like in terms of how that would play out, how that traffic would get directed perhaps towards the more progressive candidate or the progressive party? So what does that look like? And in terms of perhaps even a full day for this person, they wake up in the morning, they log in to do a search and then watch YouTube at night. I mean, how would that work if you were undecided and you're trying to find out more information?
Well, I can tell you right this minute, because we're monitoring nationwide in the US. We're monitoring all the shenanigans, all the tricks Google is using to shift votes. Right at this minute, Google is sending registered to vote reminders to members of one party, the Democrats, at 2.5 times the rate they're sending those registered to vote reminders to Republicans. Now that's happening right now, and we're capturing the data. So I'm not making this up. This is real. Now that's going to turn into, in a few months, partisan mail in your ballot reminders. Right. And that's going to happen in Australia too. And then that turns into partisan go vote reminders, which is a massive manipulation. And if you have no monitoring in place, which, by the way, is true, you have no monitoring system in place in Australia, you won't know that Google is sending out all of these partisan reminders. We know from very rigorous research that just the go vote reminder alone in the United States on election day can easily send 450,000 more votes that day to one candidate than to the other. And if there's no monitoring system in place, You will never know that that occurred. And you can't go back in time to determine that it was done, because all of that content is what Google calls ephemeral, meaning fleeting. It's fleeting content that is not stored anywhere and leaves no paper trail. 2018, there was a leak of emails from Google to the Wall Street Journal in which Google employees were discussing how can we use ephemeral content to change people's views about Trump's travel ban. So there's a leak that's actually telling you that they know darn well how to do these manipulations and that they use them every day. And that's, of course, now what we're documenting with our monitoring system. So for Australia to go without a monitoring system would be a kind of insanity. Australia happens to be one of those places that could make a big difference when it comes to these problems, these challenges that we all face. Australia could be a leader in making changes. The United States is not going to be a leader. It's true that yes, my team has built this first monitoring system, but our government is broken. It's completely broken. I was invited by Senator Ted Cruz to Washington to have a private dinner with him to talk about the tech problem and how to solve it. We talked for almost 4 hours. Here was his conclusion. Number one, he said, the Democrats here will never help because they're getting all the votes from these companies, from Google and other companies. They're getting the votes and they're getting enormous donations. They will not help. He said, and the Republicans don't like regulation. So, I mean, we're stuck in the US. Australia, which has already done some aggressive things to try to get these companies to back off, Australia could be a leader in taking on these companies.
And I think I read you said that you haven't received a targeted ad since on your phone or your computer or your laptop since 2014. Well, that's not the case with me. I went to the park with my son the other week and spoke to a man who was using one of those Minelab metal detectors, and then lo and behold started getting ads for them. And so that means whatever I'm doing, which is probably everything wrong, I'm not doing what you're doing. But the sort of things you talked about are fascinating. What are some of the things that you've done to get you out of that out of that spyware, surveillance mode?
Well, I can answer that question very succinctly by sending people to read an article of mine, which is at myprivacytips.com. So it's very easy to remember, myprivacytips.com. And it begins with that very sentence that you just said, I have not received a targeted ad on my computer or mobile phone since 2014, which is true. So, and I explain in this article how I do it. And every year or so, I update the article. And it'll just tell you straight out how you do it. There are ways to use technology so that you're not surveilled. So instead of using Google Chrome, which is a surveillance platform, you use Brave, which is the Brave browser, which is excellent. Instead of using the Google search engine, you use the Brave search engine because Brave does not track you. Brave does not use surveillance to make money. Instead of using your normal texting that you use, which is, by the way, easy for anyone with the right skills to monitor, you use Signal. Signal is free. It's run by a nonprofit organization. You can install it on any phone, and Signal protects your privacy when you're texting another person using Signal. So all of my friends and family, my colleagues, we all communicate using Signal now. Instead of using Gmail, which is one of the most aggressive surveillance platforms ever invented, you use Proton Mail. Proton is based in Switzerland. It's subject to very strict Swiss privacy laws. You can use a free version of it. Usually that'll last you at least a year. At some point, you might have to pay $7, $8 a month, but it's absolutely worth it because now your emails are protected. and no one is reading your emails unless you're stupid enough to write to someone who's using Gmail. But the point is, there's a lot you can do, and I do try to help people, and especially parents. I try to help them to escape from this terrible surveillance monster and use technology differently so that you protect yourself and you protect your kids.
The other thing is, of course, is it is very difficult. We've seen now for competition to evolve when you've got this sort of monopoly. We saw that through the Parler experience with the platform. It was pulled off the App Store and the Android Store, and then I think Amazon Web Hosting removed it from the web effectively. So it is very hard for these companies to get a foothold. I think I read that there was talk of Elon Musk's X group making their own search engine. I mean, in the current climate, how achievable is that? And is this the sort of thing that might help as well, giving people an alternative, or is that market just completely dominated now?
Google was not the first search engine. A lot of people think it was. It was actually the 21st search engine. So Google simply used very aggressive methods and a very, very, I would say, extremely accurate kind of search engine to take over the whole market. And that's what they've done. Since that time, dozens of organizations and companies have created their own search engines and have tried to compete with Google. You can't compete with Google. Now, the way to compete with them, of course, as I told you, is if the government declares their data to be public. Now everyone can compete with them, and the world would be a much better place. But generally speaking, anyone who has tried, whether it's Trump's people or anyone else with Parler or Truth Social or you name it, anyone who has tried to compete with either Google or Facebook has failed. So the thing is that search engine works very well because it's so big, and because they crawl. It's called crawling. They crawl the internet, so aggressively, and no one else has the resources to match that magnitude or to match that technical level of expertise. So we are kind of stuck again, except if either we face the fact that data now have become an essential commodity, and we just do what we've always done. That's one way to fight. And the other way to fight, which has to be done, is with monitoring. Let me just say one more thing about monitoring, just to put this into perspective. The EU has been very aggressive in trying to get Google to stop its interference in our lives and to stop them from shutting down companies. Google can shut down any company it wants to simply by demoting them in Google search results or just deleting them. And the EU has gone after them for doing those things because they do it all the time. Most people don't know this, but Google can block access to websites. They can not only remove you from their search results, they can block access to your website. They block access every day to several million websites. At one point in time, the head of Google Search literally blocked access to one entire domain name. That was 11 million websites. And on March 31st, 2009, January 31st, 2009, Google blocked access to the entire internet for 40 minutes. That was reported by The Guardian. Google did not deny it.
That is fascinating.
So Google has
how does that work? Like, how did they do that?
Yeah. That took me a couple of years to figure out. And I eventually wrote a piece for a magazine called U.S. News and World Report. The piece is called The New Censorship. If you go to the new censorship, I think .com or .org, you can actually read the piece. And I figured out how they did it. It's it's really very interesting. All browsers use Google's a special database Google has, which Google calls its quarantine list, because Google, again, its database is so big, and they crawl the internet so extensively that they're very good at identifying websites that have been hacked or that have malware on them. So every single browser there is pays Google a fee, and they check Google's quarantine list before they take you to a website. So Google is getting information about any use you make of any browser, but it also means that Google can block any browser from taking you to a website because of that quarantine list. Google can block access to any website, and they do block access to several million websites every day. So this is that took me a couple of years to finally understand how they did that, but that's how they do it. They do it through their quarantine list, and they can quarantine any website, any company. A couple of years ago, they did get into big trouble in Japan because they blocked access to half of the websites in Japan for 11 minutes, and the government got interested in that. And again, Google did not deny it. They said it was a mistake. Someone made a mistake. So, when you're talking about powers of this magnitude, it means we must not be complacent. You mentioned Eisenhower. He was warning about the rise of a technological elite, he called it, that could someday control public policy without our knowing. And you're right. When I was on Rogan, I actually said, that's where we are now. The technological elite are now in control. It's just that most people don't know that. That's where we are.
It's such a fascinating topic. There's just so much more to cover, but I'm conscious of your time. I'm also conscious of the comments you made about the monitoring system in Australia. If there are people that are interested in collaborating on that, presumably they can go and see your work. americasdigitalshield.com, I think, is the website, and of course you're on Twitter as well. But are there ways in which people that are interested in this project can sort of reach out to you and talk about it, or get more information through your website? How do they find you?
Let me give you a couple of links. First of all, you mentioned America's Digital Shield. That's America's with an S, digitalshield.com. That's a dashboard that will show you our monitoring system working in real time and the massive amount of data we're collecting. And it'll show you where Google is manipulating people right now. It'll show you political bias in the United States on Google's search engine. But let me give you a couple more links. First of all, my director of development insists that I give you this link: support.techwatchproject.org. support.techwatchproject.org. Because we pay the people who let us use their computers, which is more than 15,000 registered voters in all 50 U.S. states, we pay them a token fee of $25 a month, and which is very little considering what they're doing for us. But the point is that when we had 10,000 of them, that meant $250,000 a month. So the only way for us to be self-sustaining moving forward is we have to have thousands and thousands of people around the world who are sponsoring these people we call our field agents or our watchdogs. So if you go to support.techwatchproject.org, right now we actually have a $30,000 challenge grant. And so any money that you donate will be doubled because of this challenge grant. So I'm going to say it one more time: support.techwatchproject.org. And I'm going to give you just one more link, which is, if you really want to look at the science, the scientific work that we do, and you want to see videos and you want to read things, you really want to dig in, go to mygoogleresearch.com, mygoogleresearch.com. And that's got everything, and it will take you everywhere if you really want to see what we're doing. Because the work we're doing is very serious, and we are not politically motivated. We are nonpartisan. Okay, if anything, I lean left myself, so I should be praising Google for what it's doing, but I can't praise them.
It is absolutely fascinating, and I think this is a burgeoning area of understanding for us in the Australian Parliament. There's a lot of work to be done in there, so I just have to thank you for taking the time. I know you're very busy, you've got lots on the go, and anything that involves talking takes you away from the numbers and the research as well, but it is important that people understand what the lie of the land is. So thank you very, very much for coming on and speaking with me, and we will make sure that Australians understand a little bit more about the tech world and what it means for Australia. So thanks very much, and we really appreciate it.